Now let's talk about the adult course and start with bank failures, liquidity crisis, and insolvency, the way that banks fail.
Hi everybody, having understood the balance sheet in real detail, let's now look at two ways in which a commercial bank can fail. The first way is if a commercial bank doesn't have enough liquid short-term assets, also known as current assets, to meet its short-term liabilities, i.e. its current liabilities. What we then get is a bank run. Panic sets in, there is a run on the bank, there is a liquidity crisis within the bank. They don't have enough liquid short-term assets to meet their short-term liabilities. The second way is when the bank doesn't have enough capital to offset any losses in asset values, i.e. we get to a situation where liabilities will be greater than assets. The bank will owe more than what it owns, which means that the bank will therefore fail because the balance sheet won't balance.
That's really important. Remember that whenever any of whenever you have defaults on the assets, particularly things like advances, where they've given out a loan and the loan fails, or any other short-term or long-term investment fails, it is not from the liabilities section that the balance sheet is adjusted, but from the capital section. You must have enough shareholder funds and retained profit in order to offset any bad loans.
That is called insolvency. Both types, insolvency and a liquidity crisis or a bank run, are the two types of bank failure. Let's look at my balance sheet from my previous video and understand these two in more detail. Let's say that all depositors and all short-term lenders to the commercial bank want their money back right now. Well, you can see that will be £65 million worth of money that this commercial bank has to pay right now. These two are the current liabilities, are the short-term liabilities. So does this commercial bank have enough short-term liquid assets, i.e. current assets, to pay that money off? Well, no they don't. They've only got £20 million worth. The four current assets or short-term assets are cash, reserves at the Bank of England, money at short notice, and short-term investments. These are the four current assets. This commercial bank currently has only got £20 million worth of these short-term assets. They've got £65 million of short-term liabilities to pay, which if they have to pay those off right now, they can't do it. There will be a run on the bank, there will be a liquidity crisis here, the bank would fail. This is when you see these huge queues outside high street banks where individuals want their money back right now. That's a run on the bank.
That actually happened in Greece, and they actually had to shut down the banks in Greece because there was a bank run and everybody was trying to take their money out all at once, and they didn't have enough assets in order to cover the liabilities.
So liquidity crisis is...
I take that back. They didn't have enough liquid assets to cover the liabilities.
What would be the result there? What about insolvency? Let's take a scenario where all the loans that this bank has issued go completely bad. £40 million worth of advances in this case go completely bad. Well, they are going to be wiped off the balance sheet, written off loans here. So £40 million gone. Remember, that needs to be offset by a loss in capital. There needs to be enough capital to offset the losses in those loan values. Does this bank have enough capital? No. They only have £35 million worth of capital. What's going to happen? Well, £40 million worth of advances go, which means that total assets would be £76 million. But only £35 million worth of capital is what the commercial bank has, which means liabilities can only fall to £81 million. That means that liabilities will be greater than assets if all these loans go bad. The bank will owe more than what it owns. That is called insolvency, as we've learned. This bank will fail in that scenario there. So we understand the bank run, we understand insolvency as the two sources of bank failure. But crucially, guys, you need to know that banks don't necessarily fail in isolation. When they fail, it can cause a ripple effect throughout the financial industry. This is known as systemic risk.
There's a reason for that. It's because, remember, the banks are also borrowing money from other banks and are also lending money to other banks. And so if one bank goes bad, it has a trickle-down effect to any bank that it held or that it borrowed money from is not going to get that money back. And any bank that they have invested in, they're not going to basically they're not going to it's basically going to have a downstream effect there as well. So all these banks being connected through their investments and their borrowing mean that if one bank fails, there's always a danger that more banks will fall down like a row of dominoes. That's the systemic risk.
it's not just the commercial bank that loses out when they fail, it's other banks that can lose out too. Other banks who are holding assets that this commercial bank was liable to pay, well, those assets now are worthless. If that commercial bank doesn't have enough capital to offset the loss in those asset values, then they can go insolvent, they can go bankrupt. What about then another commercial bank who's holding assets that the second commercial bank was liable to pay? Well, those assets might be completely worthless, in which case that commercial bank may not have enough capital to offset the loss in those asset values. They may go bankrupt, insolvent, right? So you understand that there might be a ripple effect when one commercial bank goes insolvent, or if there is a bank run that they are suffering from, i.e. if this commercial bank fails, then it's lots of other commercial banks that can also take the hit and may also fail as a result. That's known as systemic risk, where one commercial bank failure can lead to many other banks failing, which can then bring down the entire financial sector, i.e. what happened in 2008. There are tools available though, which can help prevent that. Let's understand those. These are all tools available to financial market regulators to prevent bank failure, to reduce the risk of bank run, to reduce the risk of insolvency. Let's understand first the cash ratio. Just to let you know, guys, I've covered this in lots of detail in my financial market regulation video where we cover ratio analysis. Go and watch that in this playlist if you want much more detail. This is just a quick overview. So the cash ratio, imposing it or increasing it, that is forcing commercial banks to hold enough cash assets to meet their short-term liabilities. That reduces the risk of a bank run. We've got a liquidity ratio or a current ratio, which includes all the current assets, so all these four. Enforcing that or increasing that will make sure that a commercial bank holds enough short-term liquid assets to meet its short-term liabilities, again, reducing the risk of a bank run. We've got something known as the leverage ratio, that is looking at the ratio of capital to advances and also long-term investments to make sure that a commercial bank holds enough capital to offset any losses in long-term investments and advances, which in theory will reduce the risk of insolvency. So maybe imposing a leverage ratio or increasing the leverage ratio will be the regulation there. You've got capital ratios. That's very simply looking at the ratio of capital to advances, so the capital to loans ratio you can consider. And the whole idea of this is to make sure that a commercial bank will hold enough capital to offset any losses in loans that's issued there, again to prevent the risk of insolvency and to reduce therefore the risk of bank failure. You've also got the reserve requirements, so maybe imposing that or increasing that, and that is by law, making sure that when deposits are put in the commercial bank, a certain fraction are kept in the Bank of England, at the bank account within the Bank of England there. So imposing a reserve requirement or increasing the reserve requirement will make sure that the bank has always got enough liquid assets, cash in this case really, to meet the needs of depositors or any other short-term liabilities that they are liable to pay. So increasing the reserve requirement or imposing it will make sure that enough liquid assets are always held to meet any short-term liabilities, preventing the risk of a bank run and therefore bank failure. These are all covered in my financial market regulation video where we look at ratio analysis. Go and watch that video for more detailed understanding. But thank you all so much for watching this video. Stay tuned for the next one.
So now the next question
Nespresso presents.
Now the next question is, how does a commercial bank balance profit against the risk of a liquidity crisis or an insolvency crisis? And that's what we're going to discuss next.
The objective of a...
One second here. That's what we're going to discuss next.
Hi everybody, the objective of a commercial bank is simple, right? To maximize profit. The reason why? There are shareholders. You want to keep your shareholders happy. They are the ones that own the business. Without them, there wouldn't be a commercial bank. So if you're making more profit, then they get higher dividends, they're very happy. Now, shareholders are very important because you as a commercial bank manager, right, you are liable to your shareholders. If you're making loads of profit, you're going to keep your job. If you don't, you might lose your job. If you're making loads of profit, you might get a higher salary, great for you. You might get more perks, great for you. That all is going to be determined by the shareholders. So profit maximization is very important for that reason because you've got shareholders. How can you make loads of profit? Well, as a commercial bank, borrowing short-term, which is low interest, and lending long-term, which is much higher interest, gives you a great profit margin. Fantastic news. So for example, borrowing money in the money markets and lending in terms of mortgages, in terms of longer-term loans, for example, in terms of longer-term investments, all great news to maximize your profit. But also by taking more risk, that's offering less secured loans. So for example, offering loans to those who are slightly dodgy, maybe unemployment is likely in the next 6 months or something. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they're not putting down much of a deposit, more risk there. Maybe their financial history isn't as great, so you're taking more risk. By taking more risk, you can charge a higher interest. Another way to take more risk is by issuing loans that are not backed by anything. So you offer loans, and if those loans go bad, they go bad. You as a bank don't take anything back. That means you can charge a higher interest to maximize profit. Alright, so that's how you can profit maximize. Great, you keep shareholders happy, managers like it too. Workers might like it, they might get a higher salary themselves. Great news, right? But doing this is dangerous. The risk of bank failure is much higher. Bank failure is not in the commercial bank's best interest at all. Obviously, shareholders lose all their money.
That's because your advances are riskier, so there's a better chance that people will default on their loans, and that can put you at risk of an insolvency crisis. And they're borrowing short-term and lending long-term, which means that you're going to have greater amounts of money tied up into long-term assets and less in short-term liquid assets, which can lead to a liquidity crisis. Even though this makes more money, it puts the bank in a much more risky position in terms of dealing with runs on the bank, liquidity crisis, or having enough capital to offset bad loans and defaults on advances.
Bad thing for them. Managers will lose their jobs, lose their incomes. Bad news for them. Of course, they don't want bank failure. But there are deeper consequences too. For society, that's not a good thing. Systemic risk, we talked about this before, didn't we, in my previous video? How if the bank fails, it's not just them that will fail. It might be another bank that fails, and then another bank that fails, and then another bank that fails. Basically, the whole financial system can come down if one bank fails. That's bad. That's systemic risk, and the greater chance of total financial system collapse. As we know in the UK, the financial industry is the backbone of our economy. If there is financial collapse and the whole financial system goes completely into collapse, there is going to be a deep financial crisis and recession in the country. And with that, we know there'll be lost incomes, not just for those who work in the industry, but generally throughout the economy. There'll be high unemployment again throughout the economy, lost output, all bad news, completely bad news. And also there is the cost of bank bailouts, right? So the taxpayer having to bear the brunt of bank bailouts if the Bank of England decides that actually this bank can't fail. The taxpayer bears the brunt. I mean, look at what happened post-2008 and how the UK taxpayer is bearing the brunt of all these bank bailouts. Terrible news. But also it's not in the best interest of the commercial bank themselves, because if their bank is bailed out, there'll be tight regulations thereafter. There'll be tight conditions to that bailout. If the taxpayer is in control of the bank, well then managers don't have as much control, they don't have as much say as to how the bank can actually run. So it's not in the best interest of shareholders and those who work in the bank themselves if there is bank failure. Remember, there are two ways in which a commercial bank can fail. There could be a liquidity crisis where there is not enough short-term liquid assets that the commercial bank has to meet its short-term liabilities. Liquidity crisis, a bank run. The second way is that a commercial bank can go insolvent if they don't have enough capital to offset any losses in asset value. So any loans that go bad, if there is not enough capital to offset those fall in asset values, then there is insolvency. Liabilities will be greater than assets, not sustainable, and you see bank failure that way. So that means for a commercial bank, they've got to balance their objective of profit maximization with liquidity. Holding more cash, for example, holding more reserves at the Bank of England, lending more in the interbank market, for example. Now those three things will ensure there is liquidity to avoid a bank run, great, to prevent the risk of bank failure, fine, but they are not as profitable. So for example, reserves at the Bank of England, you'll only get bank rate. For example, if you lend in the interbank market, you only get LIBOR, and LIBOR, the London interbank offer rate, tends to follow the bank rate, which will be much lower than if you offer loans, longer term loans, which give you a much higher interest rate. So you sacrifice a bit of profit to keep short-term liquidity, to make sure you can meet your short-term liabilities to prevent a bank run. Fine. Security is another thing a commercial bank must be aware of. That is managing risk to avoid insolvency. Now, security, again, issuing secure loans is not the most profitable for a bank. So for example, issuing loans to very, very safe lenders, you can't charge a very high interest rate there. For example, issuing more loans that are backed by something, again, reduces the interest rate you can charge there. Now, that's all well and good doing that, but it reduces your profit-making potential. You can't make as high profits, but it means you are safer. It means you have less loans that are likely to go bad. It means that you don't need to hold as much capital, therefore. Because your loans are less likely to go bad, you're not worried about capital to offset those loans. And you've only got maybe a few loans that you think will go bad, in which case you've got enough capital to offset those loans if they go bad. So that's what security is all about, managing risk there and reducing the chance of becoming insolvent and therefore bank failure. But as you can see, for both, to keep liquidity, to make sure you're more secure and you're managing risk, you have to sacrifice a bit of profit as a commercial bank, which means it's not all about gung-ho profit maximization. Bank failure is scary. Therefore, having enough liquidity, being secure enough with the loans that you offer, is in the bank's best interest, and that means sacrificing a bit of profit. And that means the conclusion is that for a commercial bank, having balance in the portfolio of assets that they hold is in the best long-term interest of the bank, but also is in the best long-term interest of society, given these consequences of bank failure. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Hopefully that all makes sense. I'll see you all in the next video.